Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Squero, the television studio and conference hall here at Homo Faber. During this event, in this room, we welcome artisans, artists, designers, and other experts to share their stories and experiences. Today, I am very glad to introduce the first of a range of 6 talks organized in collaboration between the Michelangelo Foundation, who is organizing this wonderful exhibition here, and the Institut National des Métiers d'Art of French Crafts Council, based in Paris, which I am happy to represent here. The topic we are going to discuss today is a very important one, maybe the most important. Indeed, we are going to discuss the importance of craftsmanship in our economies, and at the same time, question the difficulties craftspeople may have to find a sustainable business model. We are going to discuss this with our 2 guests today, Nicky Dewar and Jeremy Maxwell Wintrebert. I would like to introduce first Nicky, who is going to start with our presentation. So Nicky is the head of learning and talent development at the Crafts Council in the UK. As such, she provides professional business support for makers. She will tell us about the current situation of the makers in the UK and also about how her organization, the Crafts Council, analyzes the impact, the economic impact of crafts and how they encourage the government to take this very important part of the creative industries into account. Afterwards, we will hear Jeremy, who is a glassblower, and his point of view about the difficulties to survive as a craftsman today, even though craftsmanship is more and more demanded and well seen, especially in the media. So first, I would like to welcome Nicky on stage.
Hello, thank you for inviting me today. What you're reading is a description of how we at the Crafts Council in the UK see craft, its potential for us to express ideas, to learn, to improve our communities, its place in our world. For those that don't know, the Crafts Council, we are the UK's national agency for contemporary craft. Our work spans many diverse areas, from the curation of touring exhibitions that explore craft through different lenses and perspectives, to formal education initiatives to build educator skills and increase the ways in which craft is embedded into the classroom. We host Collect, the International Art Fair for Modern Craft and Design at the Saatchi Gallery every February. We produce crafts magazines 6 times a year and manage an online directory of makers who can be commissioned for work and residencies. And our holistic program of professional support enables our makers to flourish in their businesses. We devise participation activities that encourage everyone to have a go at everyday making, celebrating those achievements and the benefits it can bring to our health and well-being. We undertake research, finding ways to use the evidence to campaign and advocate to decision makers and policy makers. We can only achieve this by collaborating with partners. We are a sector coming together, striving to reach the potential craft presents. The ability of the craft sector to influence is dependent on its voice, one that is gradually growing stronger. Following the government's confirmation of craft's place in the definition of the creative industries in 1997, the sector can insist on a role in policy development. In 2011, the Creative Industry Council, a government industry cross-sector lead body, was formed. And in 2015, the membership body, the Creative Industries Federation, of which Crafts Council sits on, has further strengthened the voice of the creative sector. Some numbers. The working practice of our makers, designers, craft professionals spans a wide spectrum of business models. For the UK, this builds an impressive contribution to our economy. Each subsector has its own pathways, hurdles, and opportunities. My team provides support for these makers, whether you're starting out or well established. Our programs and the work we do in partnership gives makers the knowledge, connections, and confidence to create successful creative businesses. Alongside honing your technique, your creative voice, and the ability to tell your story through your material are the fundamental skills needed, including resilience, flexibility, problem solving, and often the ability to work for oneself. Almost 90% of makers are sole traders or micro businesses in the UK. One example of this is James Kennedy of Kennedy City Bicycles. He's a one-man business, and he says, I get to meet my customers, discuss the design of their bicycle, build it, take them on test rides, teach them how to maintain and service it. I feel privileged to do that for so many people. It's this relationship that many consumers want with individual makers and the products they create. Craft businesses face a changing world with both opportunities and challenges. Retail has been democratized with the advent of social media. Rather than slowly building a loyal customer base through face-to-face connections at fairs or through galleries, those that are savvy can reach global new audiences from their mobile phones. For those that find the intricacies of Instagram more daunting, it's hard to keep up, especially as consumption rates for the new can be fast. Buyers are changing. Those with more disposable income are investing in fewer key pieces. The rising cost of living and greater choice on how to spend income means many customers are buying less often. And new buyers are looking for experiences as much as products, and greater value is being placed on well-being aspects of making. Many customers are rightly questioning how things are produced, the environmental impact of products, materials that are sustainably sourced. The lack of affordable workshop space in city is a well-recognised problem. Makers are struggling to access and maintain residency in these spaces, and developers, seeing the appeal of creative industries within their spaces, are working towards this. We know that shared creative spaces allow makers to collaborate, introduces them to the wider sector, to networks, galleries, and support from trusted organisations. For those makers that have not come through traditional or higher education routes, or are embarking on second careers, it can be tougher to access that support. Isolation can lead to a lack of confidence is a common problem. Exporting and international markets, we know that the next few years are going to be difficult for us. We hear that from makers that the US market is a real profitable one. But this can change. New markets are emerging, and actually for our makers to keep on top of that is a challenge. So, some case studies of those makers that we could think about as risk takers. Sally Burnett started life as a ceramics and glass specialist, which provided her with some really useful knowledge about the manufacturing processes. She then retrained in wood. Her practice focused on producing one-off wooden vessels for luxury markets, using galleries and craft fairs to build her retail customer base. Her limited US reach didn't produce enough sales, so she decided to review her practice and realized that to reach her target audience of high net wealth customers, she wanted to collaborate with interior designers. Realizing the UK wasn't the right platform for her work, she selected Maison Objet in Paris as her commitment. And so she's now decided that the next 3 years she's going to go there to build some trust and recognition. Her first event was in January, and it's hugely successful. She's now got new clients talking about her work and has commissions, and she's brought forward her second visit to January. But she's got lots of challenges. She works from home. She's facing real issues around isolation and needing to be connected. And she needed to invest that money to go on those fairs, and she only has the basic French, which sometimes causes problems. So next I'd like to tell you about Marcin, his impressive story. Marcin's a designer maker based in London, and after only 4 years, he now employs a team of 6 people and outsources significant elements of his production. He took advantage of the RSA's reputation when he graduated and the networks it gave him, and he's achieved a really fast succession of highly prized opportunities. He was selected for our own Future Made International Showcase programme. He was selected by a leading curator to be showcased at Future Heritage at Decorex, and the next year he was part of their branding for that programme. And he also was a finalist for the Jerwood Open Makers Prize. All of this has enabled him to develop new products, commissions and art pieces. And he's really reaching out to international markets, working in America as well as in some of the European countries. But he's got huge concerns about what Brexit will mean. So much of his work and the outsourcing is reliant on those export links. He's even starting to think about leaving the UK. On a different scale, Jennie Llewellyn is an award-winning contemporary jewellery designer maker based in London. Jennie's practice is driven by experimentation, colour, material, combining precious with non-precious to create tactile, fun pieces. Central to Jennie's practice is her pioneering use of silicone, often mistaken for glass or plastic. Her silicone is soft, light and durable, resulting in unique and wearable contemporary jewellery design. It's not surprising then that she has a large, loyal customer base, built from both showcasing at retail and trade fairs, but also from online. And she has a really well-defined e-commerce website, very slick and professional. The problem is she needs to grow. She's at her capacity, and she doesn't know how to do that. These wonderful makers are just one part of our craft story. Innovation in craft refers to evolution of technique, discovery of new materials, and application of new tools. Innovation through craft refers to makers facilitating or catalysing innovation elsewhere. It concerns the spillover effects of craft into other industries. The potential benefits, economic, social, creative, are huge. It is this that enabled Britain to quietly build up a £3.4 billion making economy, influencing everything from the automotive industry to smartphones. In 2016, we commissioned KPMG to investigate this process and the impact of innovation through craft. And the diagram you can see on screen is a result of this piece of work. They found that craft skills and knowledge have a strong economic impact and a significant potential to drive further growth and innovation in other sectors. Lauren Bowker is a great example of great craft innovation. A textile alchemist whose colour-changing materials led to designs for devices that can monitor body and environment. Commissions from her company, The Unseen, include tracking car aerodynamics Formula One, and in healthcare, creating bandages and soft devices that monitor patient conditions. So how can we encourage this to happen more? Our innovation report identifies the barriers that stand in the way of realising the full potential. Lack of understanding of the value of craft innovation, the degree of risk that leads to underinvestment in innovation by individual firms, and the underinvestment in craft education and skills. Currently, most innovation through craft happens through happy accident. The diagram you saw is the vision to move via strategically focused investment and actions to an established culture of open innovation and collaboration. The potential rewards are great. Improved productivity, development of new products and services, and uniqueness of UK output, enabling us to access new global markets and reap both social and economic benefits. The UK enjoys a great global reputation for its creative industries and for craft. However, international competitors are fast catching up, investing heavily in creative education, in research and development, and in facilities that bring the physical, making, and digital worlds together. China is a case in point, but the same is happening to different degrees in other parts of Asia, North America, Europe, and Africa. Unless we take action now, we'll experience a talent drain and lose competitive advantage. The continued erosion of craft alongside all creative subjects within the English school system is a crisis exacerbating the situation. We are losing our specialist teachers. Teaching time for arts is diminished, and in too many schools, the opportunity to study any craft subject has been completely removed. It's no surprise that craft is not valued, and parents are wary of supporting their children to take this career pathway. So what are we doing about it? In 2014, we produced an education manifesto, Our Future in the Making, created by the sector and listing changes that we need to bring. Opportunities to make in schools, training of our craft educators, and the bringing together of that community of practice. And at the Crafts Council, we're shaping activities and working with partners to address these challenges and advocate for greater support to embed making back into our classrooms. We've taken a significant step forward last year with the creative industries being included in the government's industrial strategy white paper. Although more could have been done to address the pipeline between education and employment, it is heartening to see specific commitment to a careers programme. That there is no right or wrong route in craft is an important message we need to share with our future makers. It will help us diversify this next generation of craft professionals, making sure that everyone has this opportunity, not just those who are able to undertake unpaid internships or can utilise word-of-mouth connections. By opening up the world of craft to everyone, we enable fresh thinking, new experiences, better questions, and that all-important innovation to flourish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicky. I would like now to introduce our second guest for today, Jeremy Maxwell Wintrebert. Jeremy, he's a glass blower based in Paris. He uses the freehand technique he learned through apprenticeships in the US and in Europe. Jeremy is taking commissions for very large-scale installations, and he provides an exclusive, all-encompassing service, which means he manages the project from its conception to the production, of course, and also the installation of the pieces. So Jeremy is going to tell us about his own experience as a craftsman having its own studio in Paris now. Please, Jeremy.
Hi. First, I just wanted to thank Homo Faber and Institut National des Métiers d'Art for inviting me to this conference and to share my thoughts on this topic of economy and craft. I have been a glassblower for almost 20 years. The first 10 years I spent working from studio to studio, learning the language of the craft in order to one day be able to express myself with it. On this road, I discovered an entire world which saved, structured, and shaped my life. The past 10 years I have worked for designers, participated in many collaborative workshops, taught classes, and opened my own studio in downtown Paris, which has created 6 full-time jobs and has initiated many to the art of glassblowing. I have not worked for anyone else's creative projects for the past 6 years and created an economy around my own creative craft. Shaping a hot piece of molten glass is not just an isolated singular moment in one's existence, but it is attached to a way of being which has liberated and molded our consciousness for hundreds and thousands of years. The idea that the language I use to express myself with glass, which is around 5,000 years, is older than the language I am using to speak to you today, simply fascinates me. It tells me that, just like any language, it is an extension of our consciousness, but also of our history. Within it lies many crucial ingredients which have survived time because of their significance to not just our survival, but our growth consciously. Sometimes I fantasize about the time when our entire surroundings were handmade, a time when whatever object and whatever its purpose was made by the hands of man. But the value and importance of the history of craft is not one of making, but rather of creating. It is this nuance which I believe is the problem with the economy of craft today. The economic paradox is that we don't recognize the creative value in craft. We instead shift the creative value away from those who work with their hands and give it to who commandeers them. The ones who are considered the more intellectuals and that are not bound by their hands. This is a way of separating the head and the hand. I believe that this amputation has contributed to many social issues we are experiencing today, like unemployment, waste, or even depression, and simply to the decline and sometimes disappearance of craft. At the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when machines started replacing man, It was seen as a progress. For many reasons, this is true. Very quickly, this led to a huge wealthy capitalist structures which prospered in production and consumption. It was a massive success. For those countries who were at its beginning, Unfortunately, in order to sustain its growth and power, we needed to somehow produce more and consume more. Slowly, the hand disappeared from our everyday objects as machines took over. Today, a lot of people live in homes that don't have one single handmade object. Entire social classes, actually. Houses filled with objects imagined through computers and produced by machines. Sadly, as the hand vanished from our daily lives, so did the value of its creativity. Somehow we thought that if we could free the hands of labor, we could focus, isolate, and maximize the power of our creativity. Of course, this is true on a certain level, but it also has created a hierarchical structure in which the hand is no longer recognized as a source of creativity, which fuels the well-being of our society, but instead, we almost consider it as an obstacle. Craftsmen who contribute their creativity in the process of making works are almost never mentioned when such work is shown in the media or on social networks. Like in many other creative fields, I believe it should be a law that a craftsman involved creatively in any project should be referenced with the work. In the world of photography and film, for example, this has been institutionalized and is very straightforward. The solution would satisfy proper exposure for the craftsman and also somewhat officially acknowledge his creativity, which otherwise would stay in the shadows. It would also permit he or she to sell copyright of the image of the work if the client wanted to completely own the rights and therefore compensate the craftsman for the lack in exposure and potential future business. When a creative craftsman makes other people's ideas, he almost never invoices his creative input. There are many reasons for this. One being, he was never taught to do so. But it is also not expected and would probably create conflict. This could be solved on an educational level. Schools could teach craftsmen how to estimate and value their creativity in the realization of a project, enabling the craftsman to monetize his creative investment by identifying it as such and adding it to the regular production costs as it usually involves research which does not only take time but also consumes materials. This could help the craftsman to develop economically and to have a more sustainable business. Quality standards were raised with better thought-through projects. There would also be a financial compensation for the craftsman. There would be also financial compensation for the craftsman if the client were to seek cheaper production elsewhere once the work generated demand. Now that it is isolated, research and development, the craft could also benefit from more advantageous tax breaks. The British Council did a study to look and build a case around the economic importance of craft. It is full of tables and numbers that it can be quite confusing and hard to understand. But one result did stick out, which I thought was really interesting. They compare the amount of money generated by creative craftsmen and non-creative craftsmen over the period of a year. Interestingly, per person, the amount of money generated is the same. If we agree that the most important value of man is his creativity, then why is it not reflected economically in this statistic? When the Industrial Revolution started early 19th century, a craftsman by the name of William Morris stood up against the machines and dedicated his life to promoting the importance of craft and ultimately founded the arts and craft movement, an incredibly powerful creative movement which later inspired the Art Nouveau period, which in its turn symbolized a return to a more creative craft society. In the late 70s, 80s, and part of the 90s, a small movement which was called the Studium Movement came onto the scene. Unfortunately, even with the success of these periods, these movements were not sustainable. And it is my core belief today that the problem lies in how we consider the creative value in crafts. We are lucky to live in what I believe is another small revolutionary period for craft. Events like this one show that, as a society, we are waking up to the problem, and we are once again giving ourselves the opportunity to change and contribute to a healthier society. Only now the machines have evolved into incredibly complex computers, which are plugged into an entire virtual world called the internet, where creativity has become diluted and incredibly cheap. I have many ideas to propose for solving such a problem. For example, on an educational level, instead of trying to turn craft schools to look more like design or art schools with more computers, 3D printers, and smaller ateliers, we should teach the next generation the value of manual creativity and give them the tools to invoice and protect it. We should raise their confidence by teaching them the history of their craft and why it is such an important and crucial part of our culture as a whole. Through education, we need to somehow influence a generation of craftsmen with the ambition of building careers around their creativity and give them the confidence to do so by not compromising their creativity, but instead how to inscribe it in the contemporary economic landscape. I think we also need to come to terms with the fact that all people who gravitate around craft and use it to legitimize themselves and their businesses might not always have the best intentions. There are many thriving economic models built on this unbalance when it comes to the creative value of craft, but disguise themselves as being for the cause. Lastly, I would suggest an alternative to these lavish conferences. When I look at the future, I see national monuments refurbished by craftsmen and turned into community centers, shelters, or ateliers. I see craftsmen getting involved in places of healing like our hospitals. We could study the effects on emergency rooms by replacing lifeless objects and decors with instead intention, spirit, and meaning. Imagine the emergency room, a place where we are at most vulnerable, filled with warmth and meaning. In the future, I see big associative workshops in communities who have poor economic structures with high unemployment, bringing creativity back at the heart of these communities. I truly believe craft is a solution to many societal issues while being financially sustainable. I think we need to be visionaries whilst using the DNA of what it means to be a craftsman. We should not forget that initially it is craft which shaped our civilization and its evolution. It is craft which brought communities together, like when the leather workers needed to be closer to the woodworkers, or when we started building big structures that sometimes took generations. Entire communities would be created by craftsmen that would come together around monumental projects. In the future, I see man taking a more manual control of his destiny by shaping it with, yes, his hands. I heard somewhere that if we want to change the world, we must first change ourselves. Although it is easy to point the finger at those who wrong us, it is also up to us to change our ways in order to adapt, evolve in a world ever-changing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Now I invite Nicky and Jeremy to join me on stage for the debate, and then we will open to your questions. So first, Jeremy, you underlined that one of the biggest problems might be that craftspeople find it difficult or don't think about invoicing the creative part of their work when they sell something. So do you think, is it a problem especially in France where you work, but I know you work for many other countries, so do you think it's a typical French or European problem?
My professional experience in working for other people has been in France and in Europe. The point I'm making is European-based. I don't know if they do it in the States, but I do know that when craftsmen make work for other people and they resolve the technical problems creatively, their creativity is not invoiced naturally. They just don't do that. And sometimes when they do, because maybe I suggested it to them, it creates conflict with the clients.
Nicky, how is the situation in the UK? Because you mentioned that the Crafts Council, for example, is organizing Collect. Collect, in a way, it's an art fair. So is it so that in the UK, the craftspeople are more considered as artists and there is no such a distinction between makers, artists, and other type of arts?
I think for us, Collect is really important because it's just an opportunity to showcase a certain type of craft that we make in the UK. I think that for us, we value the work that we do with Collect alongside the work that we do at all different levels. And I think that trying to show that when you say craft, it spans everything from community groups coming together for health and well-being reasons to use their hands for something that wouldn't have a same value as a piece of beautiful glass or ceramics that are on show for Collect. For us, the fact that the Crafts Council supports all of those different activities shows that craft has this huge, complex and wide-ranging place in our community and in our world. But absolutely, Collect is a great way for us to show that it is fine art in the same way.
And is it easier then for makers to invoice their creativity, as Jeremy mentioned, you think? Do they receive copyrights or royalties?
I think it's an interesting argument. I'd be interested to go back and actually explore it in more depth. I think that for a lot of our makers who are sole traders and independent makers, actually just pricing their products and their time correctly from the outset, let alone thinking about creativity, is a massive hurdle. And I know that's one of the things that we spend a lot of time talking to emerging makers is about how they think about pricing themselves correctly, because they struggle. They don't understand how to do that basic formula. And I think that thinking about the whole aspect of what they're bringing to their practice is something that needs to be considered, and they often don't think about it. But again, I think there's an element of being cautious about setting the value in their work, and I think that's a big piece of work that we do a lot of the time, is actually getting them to take a step back and to look at what they're producing, and to actually ask them more challenging questions about who their market is, and being more confident about the work they're producing.
Another point you made, you gave us some figures. The Crafts Council wrote a report called Measuring Craft Economy, and in this report you mentioned the figure of 3.4 billion pounds generated by the crafts economy in the UK, which seems very important. At the same time, you also mentioned that in the UK, 90% of the crafts businesses are sole traders or micro businesses. So maybe the difficulty lies also in the fact that these businesses are very small, or most of the time are one-man, one-woman business. How can we show how big, how important these businesses are for our economies today? Maybe, Jeremy, you want to start about this?
I mean, it kind of goes back to what I was saying. There's, for some reason, the society has shifted, and we're less willing to spend on local craft. We're more willing, because of marketing and so many reasons, people are more willing to spend their money otherwise, and they don't have the sort of same reflex to spend their money on their local craftsmen because they're a part of their community. How do those singular people in their workshop by themselves solve that problem? It's complicated. I really think it has to come the change has to come from the top in a way. You know, it's a collective consciousness change. I mean, we have to somehow get people involved again in investing in their local craftsmen. You know, putting that weight on the shoulder of, you know, one craftsman in a community is
of
massive.
course.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it's a bigger society problem we have to solve all together.
Absolutely.
Nikki, you want to?
I think there are different elements of that challenge that has to all tie together. I think that the education challenge is one element, that if we actually value it within our school system and allow our children to have the opportunity to explore making, then they become brought up with the notion that it's something that they should be and want to be doing, so that the next generation do feel more comfortable and confident in it. If we start to recognise the potential that craft has in that spillover effect I mentioned in those other industries, and actually raise the value of actually craftsmen alongside those engineers or other technical specialists, whatever the industry is, then we start to see actually that craft is an important part of so many different areas in our world. So I think that to influence government, we need to be showing lots of different arguments that win different points. I think that there's more conversation quite recently about the well-being as well. It's a big issue for us at the moment, and the potential for the arts to be prescribed by doctors to actually do more for our people that are suffering mental illnesses and health issues. So I think that there is a coming together of all of those different elements that actually support the reason why craft is just so fundamental to our communities.
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, there's definitely there's a huge lack in education when it comes to craft. If you know, in France, craft schools, technical schools, what as they call them, are lacking massively in how to educate a contemporary craftsman and what it means to be a craftsman, because they can also teach this language to those young craftsmen, and so when they go out in the world and go back in their communities, they can have more confidence in displaying what they do and displaying what they are, and they can have an integral understanding why it's important that they are there, you know, because it's important that craftsmen are part of the communities. If get rid of craftsmen, it's just going to be computers.
So maybe at this point, do we have any question from the audience? Don't be shy. No? Over there. You're going to get the microphone.
Do you think there's potential for craftspeople within the digital economy, and I think specifically of things like 3D printing?
I think there probably is. I think that also a lot of the makers that we're talking about at the moment also see that their new technology as a part of their toolkit. So for many, they're thinking about how can they utilize that to influence their practice in new ways. But I think, as Jeremy spoke about earlier, it's about understanding the potential for it rather than committing to it as a whole piece. So it's about using what you need to use at the right time. So I think there's probably options both to become digital makers and to think about fab labs and maker spaces and what impact they can have on the craft sector, as well as how we can support our craft makers to utilize these as additional tools to the more traditional tools.
I'm not against 3D printing. I mean, there's definitely a market for it, and it's exploding. But when it comes to craft, and this is just very basic, but you compare an object made by a 3D printer and an object made by hand, they just don't have the same feeling. They don't have the same presence. They don't have the same spirit. And I'm not saying that they can't coexist. That's, of course, I mean, this is called evolution. But I truly believe that handmade objects have a place and have something to say in that conversation. and the potential of 3D printing, seeing the machine and seeing the marketing and seeing what we need and this drive for consuming and for, you know, more consumption, less cheaper prices, blah, blah, blah. You know, that 3D printer sort of feeds into that. So, you know, it contributes to that sort of unbalance. And on the other side, you have, you know, people like me who make everything with their hands, and it's just, you know, it's very disappointing because it's, you know, being a craftsman today is just, you have to fight. You have to, it's so difficult, you know, and to think that somebody can just take a 3D virtual picture of whatever you made, hit a button, and a robot just goes ahead and, you know, and somehow that in the collective consciousness is going to be spread through Instagram, but, you know, via millions and millions of people, and it's going to look like a, you know, it's a great picture, but ultimately the object is lifeless, you know, and that, I just think that's a bit sad, you know.
Thank you. We have another question over there.
Thank you. I'm walked in a little bit late. I don't know if you brought this up before, but what's the data, what do research studies say about art therapy? If one does art, then craft, does it make a patient better? Is it better than giving antidepressants? Or, you know, can we say that to doctors that talk therapy, no medicines, and send them to art school or send them to craft school? Would that work? I hope so.
I can't quote you any facts or figures off the top of my head, but I know that there are reports that the UK Arts Council have produced recently that are starting to demonstrate the impact that the arts can have on health and well-being, and that's definitely a growing conversation about arts being prescribed by doctors. So it's a really great step forward. I think it's probably anecdotally something we all know a lot, and we get to hear it from people who engage with social craft making clubs that come together, who talk about it being their lifeline, stopping them from feeling very isolated and the depression that can cause. We've got numerous tales about that, and I'm sure that there are some more sort of more robust evidence out there that exists.
There was also in the 40s and 50s a movement. You know, there were books written by Montessori or Freinet in France that talked about the importance of manual education, manual creative education at an early age for the good constitution of a person. And on the other side of this equation, I don't know where I heard this recently, but they surgeons use their hands, and they've come to realize that surgeons are less and less skilled with their hands because they spend so much time learning, their job. And so now that they're actually trying to get surgeons to throw clay, do woodworking, do these manual creative things so that they can reconnect their brain with their hands and be better surgeons. Actually, I think that came from...
Yeah, it's from the UK, I think.
We did a really exciting piece of work a couple of years ago where we match-made makers with different academics, and one of those pairings was a wonderful craftsperson called Celia Pym, who's known for her darning work, who was actually based in the University Hospital in London King's, where she was in the dissecting room. And it was where the students were learning how to cut open bodies and to stitch bodies. And she was just tucked around the corner from where all the cadavers were. And when it got a little bit too much for those students, they could quite legitimately just say, I'm just going to go and have a word with Celia, rather than having to show themselves up as about to faint. And could go and talk to her, and she would do some very gentle stitching with them. And part of the work she did was inviting them to bring precious items of clothing that were showing wear and tear, and she would show them how to darn them and repair them, and do it quite beautifully and obviously. And so as they were talking about the care, the reason why this item of clothing was beautiful for them and why they had such a strong feeling about it, they were learning to stitch. And as they were learning to stitch in this space where the cadavers were, they were able to take those new skills of using needles back and think about the fact that the bodies and the people they were going to be treating needed to be taught and to be dealt with in exactly the same way as that's precious piece of clothing. So it had a huge effect on those students when Celia was in residence there. It was a really wonderful, exciting project.
Any other question? Let's see. Yes, here.
Thank you. You're talking a lot of craftsmanship as a single person factory, like a single person. But in Italy, we have a lot of factories that are made of more people that are craftsmen, okay, craftsmen. And do you think that is good for our economy to I don't know if there is a product that is mass produced, okay, but is from the specialty of a craftsman. Do you think that it's good to put the name and we underline the importance of the craftsmen that do that kind of product also in a big industry, and what this can be, and how this can be put in the pricing equation that you were talking about before? Thank you.
So part of my experience, my professional experience working is I worked in Murano, so this is a good example, right? I worked in the glass factory. I worked for a glass maestro in Murano, so I know a little bit about the history of Murano. And I mean, we all know that the economy of Murano hasn't been doing very well, and for the past 20, 25 years, 30 years has just been really declining severely. I believe that one of the reasons for that is they have a strong secrecy around their craft, right? They, letting out the secret of the craft is like you could get killed, and so I think that suffocated the economy of Murano, but also, and this is my point, which is I also believe that a lot of those fornaces, the factories, what they did very early on was bring in designers and artists, the big names to put on the products, and didn't really put forth their glassblowers, their maestros, who were involved in the creative process. And I believe that this kind of dynamic doesn't incite younger generations to want to go and work in a factory for 45 years and break their backs and sweat, and because at the end of the day, they're never really paid well, they're never really recognized, and there are, you can see even in Murano in the past 30 years, in the 80s, there were a few glassblowers that left their fornaces and tried to start their own studios and live as independent craftsmen, and they had a very hard time doing so, and I think this was a symptom of how suffocating it was. And I truly believe that, yes, if those fornaces put their maestros more in the limelight, gave them more creative, paid them for their creativity and justified their creativity and respected their creativity just as much as they did for the artists and the designers that came through, I believe that, yeah, this decline wouldn't have been so severe and they wouldn't have closed so many fornaces.
Nicky, do you want to add something on this?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't know, I think. Probably because I just don't know enough about the businesses. I think that it's interesting, you think about the potteries is one of the sort of most well-known surviving big businesses in the UK, and the way in which they've adapted and changed over the years. And the smaller potteries that are coming up in Stoke are part of that conversation that's happening, I think, in the area about how do they work with some of those bigger names like Wedgwood, and that name survives, and the makers that were part of that journey for all those years perhaps haven't survived. So I think there's an interesting challenge for how do you maintain a business over a long time and sustain that growth, when you know that actually there is a sort of evolution of the people behind it. So I can see that there's probably complex arguments for and against doing what you've suggested.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to thank very much Jeremy and Nicky for being here. Thank to the Michelangelo Foundation for inviting us to be in this wonderful conference hall for this very important topic. Well, thank you very much. I encourage you to stay for our second talk today, and well, thank you.